guys? Welcome into the FANATICS podcast. I'm your host, Hani. Joined with me, as always, it's Zeeshan.
Yo.
Alright, man. This is probably my favorite episode that we do every single year. It is the trade deadline episode. It's the episode where we are going to basically break down what's to expect with this coming trade deadline. Now, at the time of this recording, there's about a week left until the trade deadline. And man, there's a lot going on. Like, I think this is personally one of the more eventful trade deadlines, or at least that I've been a part of over the last like few years, man. Like, it's definitely a lot more interesting. There could be a lot of moving parts going around in this trade deadline. Plus, we're also pretty invested in this one. But yeah, no, I think this is definitely going to be a pretty exciting one.
When people say that the NBA is like a drama first, this is basically it, right? The NBA trade deadline has become an event in and of itself over the past few years, especially now with the shorter contracts.
Players just asking out left, right, and center.
With players' ability to move, teams' ability to move players now, even players who seem untouchable or their contracts can't be moved, they can now be moved as like much easier. So ideally, I think everyone expects this trade deadline to be interesting, but we'll see how much it actually lives up to the hype. I think a lot of that. I think, there's not going to be... I don't anticipate much movement until the trade deadline actually happens. That, I think, is going to have a lot to do with the first team we're going to talk about.
Well, I think a lot of this deadline is going to be surrounded... Because I think the good thing is that there's a lot of teams there's some sellers, but there's a lot of teams that are trying to load up with big playoff runs, which makes some of these bigger trades more possible because the sellers want to get assets. The buyers are more willing to shell out those assets in order to get in pieces to make deep playoff runs. So definitely something to look forward to.
One more point too. I think like a number of GMs have also talked about it, where this year feels very different at the trade deadline because of the fact that it's so even around the league. There's so much parity that teams don't know whether to buy or to sell because everyone feels like they have, minus obviously the bottom teams, everyone feels like they have a chance. Yeah. And the bottom teams feel like, hey, if we sell right now, we get a couple of pieces, we could be there in the future and it won't take maybe 5 years, maybe it'll take like 2 years and we'll be back to doing what we do, right? So I think this is a very interesting year. And I think in this sense, like the NBA this season has been really good and the ratings I think have reflected that because of the fact that, the parity that this new NBA has brought has been good for business of like everywhere across the NBA.
Yeah, for sure. It's been definitely a lot more competitive, and it makes these decisions a lot more impactful, which is great for us as fans because obviously bring out your popcorn for the drama. But before we even jump right in, if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the show on all the various platforms. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and of course on YouTube. Subscribe so you don't miss any more great content from us in the future. Of course, there's going to be the trade deadline that we're predicting in this episode, but we also are going to be breaking down some of the trades that will happen, after the trade deadline in our next episode. So definitely stay tuned for that. But for this episode, we're deciding to break down, some of the teams that will be most involved in the trade deadline. And we broke them down to some of the buyers and the sellers. And kind of we'll break down kind of some names, kind of give you guys the rundown of why teams are in certain categories and what they're potentially looking for based on their current situation. And starting us off with the sellers, because this one, it cuts a little deep for us. I'm not going to lie. This one is not really a fun topic to talk about for us, but it does make the trade deadline a lot more interesting. And we're talking about the Toronto Raptors, arguably the team that a lot of rumors are circulating that this team is going to be setting the precedence for the trade deadline. The moves that Toronto is going to potentially make is what's going to set the market in terms of what type of deals we're going to be seeing. And that mostly is because this has been a pretty waste season for the Raptors in general. I mean, they've been pretty bad. I mean, they're a bottom 6 team in the NBA right now. They're just not good on either end of the floor. Despite having some bright spots and a few good players into the Pascal, Scotty Barnes is starting to reemerge. Fred has even been able to turn it around a little bit as of late. But just the wins aren't coming. And in a league that has gotten a lot more competitive, it makes, like, the more losses you take up, the gap to go back into being competitive just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, the margin of error is a lot slimmer now with everyone, literally every team being a good team.
Yeah, no, for sure. So definitely it's been a waste of a season for the Raptors. So they we're gonna classify them as sellers in this trade deadline. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they have a lot of players on trade-friendly contracts and contracts that you've heard all the rumors about some of the players that some teams are, inquiring about. Like Fred VanVleet, he's on an expiring deal. He has a player option at the end of this season worth about $22 million. Gary Trent Jr. also has a player option at the end of this season. He's going to be most likely opting out and looking for a bigger deal. Then you have guys with about 2 years left that teams that would really look to get off Toronto's hands in terms of OG Anunoby with 2 years left on his deal. Obviously, the reports are that OG wants a bigger role. Now, I don't really buy that. I think it's Clutch Sports really trying to up OG's trade value.
Well, I mean, Toronto's already tried that. It hasn't worked out.
Exactly. But ultimately speaking, OG Anunoby is a team that a lot of teams have been really interested in. And then, of course, Pascal Siakam is the biggest name on the Raptors. And if the Raptors really want to tear it completely down, they could try to get a haul for Pascal Siakam. And a lot of teams would be interested in him. Now, in terms of what the Raptors' financial situation kind of looks like, well, the thing is the Raptors are in a very interesting spot because they could be sellers, they could completely tear it down, or they could potentially be buyers and swap out some parts and get some players that could potentially help them regain some momentum in this season. Now, to be fair, the odds of that happening are quite slim. So, in our opinion, you have a young player in Scotty Barnes. Most likely, you're going to end up with a top maybe 7 pick at this moment. Maybe you take the season for what it is. You retool. You trade one of your players because the Raptors have to make a move. At this point, the way the season has gone, the way the contract situation has played out, is to the point where they need to trade one of their core guys. Be it a Fred VanVleet, be it a Gary Trent Jr., be it potentially an OG Anunoby. But I think the two guys I wouldn't trade on this team are Pascal Siakam and Scotty Barnes. I think the Raptors need to do something similar to what Golden State did a couple of years ago when Steph and Klay were both hurt. It wasn't a great season for them. They ended up getting a top 3 pick in that draft.
It didn't really work out for them.
It didn't really work out for them. But again, they were able to retool their roster. And then the following year, they ended up winning a championship. Or a year or two after that, they won a championship. So I think that's sort of the mindset that Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster are really taking into consideration. Now, the thing about the Raptors is they have all their picks, and a lot of teams are interested in their guys, which is great for them. I mean, apparently there's reports that OG Anunoby could get about roughly 3 first-round picks.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with the Gobert trade.
Yeah.
Right? No. Gobert said the president, if a team can give up, 5 picks? 5 picks for Gobert. And, I mean, Gobert hasn't been great this season. I think he's getting underrated, though. But he still, nonetheless, hasn't been great this season. But if Gobert can command 5 picks, OG's a fringe all-star player. I'm sure he could command 3 picks at least.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of teams are willing to give him because of the type of player OG is. He's a well-established 3-and-D player. He's one of the best defenders in the league. He can shoot the 3 ball pretty well. And again, he's still young and on a team-friendly deal. I mean, what is he making? $18 million over the next couple of seasons? That's nothing for most teams in this league. So obviously, a lot of teams are interested in them. Now, what would they potentially, want? What are the Raptors kind of looking for? Well, obviously, they're looking for young players they can build around, young players they can kind of surround Scotty Barnes and Pascal Siakam with, and players that they can actually fit the rotation. Like right now, they don't have guys that are really working right now, so they need to get guys who can come in and that will work. Then potentially they can get draft picks, and I think draft picks are really important. But more importantly, I would rather, if I'm the Raptors, get guys they can utilize right now. And who would they potentially trade with? Well, obviously the Memphis Grizzlies and New Orleans Pelicans are the 2 teams that are bidding for OG Anunoby. Which one of them will give them the better offer? Only time will tell. But those 2 teams definitely have a few assets. Obviously, Dylan Brooks comes to mind. Trey Murphy from, Dyson Daniels from New Orleans. Like, there's some good names there. Phoenix has also emerged as a potential option where they might be willing to part ways with Cam Johnson. There might be conversations with DeAndre Ayton, although I don't love those conversations. But they're in the mix. New York, with their abundance of picks, could be involved as well. So there's a lot of teams, a lot of suitors for some of the Raptors players. But it's just a matter of what direction does Masai and Bobby really want to go. And I personally think they're going to lean more towards the retool. But one thing is clear. One of their big core guys is moving at this deadline. And I think it has to be done. It's time for them to make a big move.
Well, I think ideally one of them would be moving. But knowing this front office, nothing could happen, and that would be on par, right?
That is true.
That is a very real possibility, and I do believe if nothing happens on the Raptors' end, I think this trade deadline is going to be very boring.
Yeah.
But yeah, that could also be the case for the Raptors, where they just don't feel like there's an offer that's good enough. And nor do I want them to take an offer that would be bad, you know.
They're in a good place where they can dictate their future. They can dictate the market and what they can get in return. But, you know, in terms of us as fans and in terms of the product that we're seeing on the court, a move I would like to see them make a move. Now, what that move will be, I don't know, but I would like to see some sort of change on this roster.
Yeah, talking about another team that's going to potentially be a seller, it's the Chicago Bulls. Now, they did have some success last season initially. We remember them having like a top defense, having the best defensive backcourt in the league, having great scoring duo with Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan. Unfortunately, it all came crashing down back to earth, and this season has continued that. They are currently the 11th seed in the Eastern Conference, despite the fact that they field a number of big names in DeMar DeRozan, Zach LaVine, Nikola Vucevic, Alex Caruso. Ideally, they should have a much better record, but they're just not a good overall team. And that's basically been the story of the Chicago Bulls and this iteration of it. Now, for the Chicago Bulls, they do have a number of expiring and cap-friendly deals. They have Nikola Vucevic, who's on an expiring deal. Alex Caruso's been another player that's been mentioned in trade deadline talks. Patrick Williams has one more year, though he is on his rookie contract, so it'll be interesting to see what happens on that end. Kobe White, I think we know the Kobe White experiment, or sort of, you know, the project that is Kobe White, is likely finished in Chicago. And then you have a number of, you know, veteran players, Andre Drummond, Goran Dragic, who can be dumped on, you know, contending teams looking for some extra depth to shore it up. So Chicago, I think, is in a very interesting spot. Like I said about Nikola Vucevic, I don't know which teams really want him, considering he is on a $22 million deal. However, he is expiring. I don't know for him as a player what contending teams he would fit on.
He's a tough player to move.
Yeah, he's a tough player to move, but I think a team, you know, that's willing to eat his salary in exchange for, you know, a couple of picks. For example, what Brooklyn did a couple of years back before Kyrie and KD. You know, any of these teams, for example, maybe a Detroit or something like that, who, you know, sell some tickets, I guess, part ways with a low draft pick, you know, get some value of that nature. So I think Chicago will be an interesting team. They can possibly go down the soft rebuilding route. I say soft rebuilding route just because of the fact that they have the Zach LaVine contract on their books. That's not getting moved anytime soon. And I think Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley have shown that they are not really fans of rebuilding, considering what they pulled last year when they tried to really go all in. So, yeah, man, I think Chicago there's some similarities between Chicago and Toronto in their situations. I think Chicago is more on the older side, and so that'll dictate what happens. But yeah, I think Chicago will be an interesting team at the trade deadline, similar to Toronto, where, you know, they could pull some moves or they might just not do anything.
Yeah, the only difference between Chicago and Toronto really just comes down to the fact that Toronto's players are a lot more desirable and on better contracts that teams are willing to take on. Plus, Toronto has all their picks, which also helps them out as well. But yeah, definitely Chicago is definitely going to be pretty interesting at the deadline to see if they're going to do anything in their situation. Which brings us into the final team that we classify as a seller come this trade deadline. And it's no surprise that the San Antonio Spurs are on their mission to tank for Victor Wembanyama. Now, somehow, they still aren't the worst team in the league because Detroit and Charlotte seem to exist. But, hey, man, the Spurs could, you know, pull some strings and tank pretty hard. You know, and then I think
that was the hope.
That's the plan.
You know, Greg Popovich really squeezes talent out.
Yeah, man, that was the plan, man. But obviously, Greg Popovich is such a great coach. But I mean, again, they pretty much are putting anybody up for grabs on their team. Maybe besides a couple of names, maybe Devin Vassell, Keldon Johnson. You know, those are sort of like their untouchables, I'd say. But everyone else is really up for discussion. Now they do have a few trade-friendly contracts. Obviously, Doug McDermott is their highest-paid player currently on their roster, which is pretty insane. He has about 2 years left at about $13 million. Maybe a contender would be able to part ways with a few picks to take Doug McDermott. Josh Richardson on an expiring deal with $12 million. Jakob Poeltl is probably their biggest name that they could move, because a lot of contenders would be interested in Jakob Poeltl, who's also on an expiring deal with about $9 million, which is pretty much nothing for a lot of teams at this moment. So they have some names that they can move. And again, the Spurs are really just looking for draft picks, and lots of them. They have a ton of cap space, so they could potentially take on bad contracts from teams in order to get some draft picks. And, really they can move around the market that way and really help the I think the Spurs will be a big, component to the buyout market, where if they acquire some big name with a draft pick, like on a bad contract, they can buy them out and potentially, go down that route as well. So the Spurs, of course, are your traditional sellers where they're just trying to tear everything down. But they do have some interesting names that I think a lot of teams would be interested in.
Yeah, man. I think the Spurs, in terms of like the rest of the bench, it gets pretty rough. But I think, around their top 7 or so, there's some quality NBA players like over there. Josh Richardson, I don't think you mentioned him, but he's on an expiring deal as well. Quote unquote a good 3-and-D guy. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't.
He could be good depth for a contender.
Ask Dallas Mavericks fans how much they love him. And yeah, even like a guy like Zach Collins, despite his injury issues, when he's on the court, we've seen his value as kind of do-it-all big man who can help a team out. Romeo Langford's another young player who's on an expiring deal and could fetch some, assets for him. So I think the Spurs are your typical, as you mentioned, the typical, selling team. Team that's basically just doing whatever they can to get that top pick. Yeah. And so, yeah, like you mentioned, the buyout market, I think there'll be, a candidate there. And so it'll be interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So those are some of the sellers that we wanted to bring up. Let's flip things over to the buyers. Now, the buyers are usually the more aggressive teams that are going to be contacting these sellers and trying to get some pieces to go on deep runs.
Moving on to another team who will potentially be a buyer at the trade deadline. We're talking about the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, the Memphis Grizzlies are basically, on that next step of their timeline where they got the young guys, and now they're officially trying to contend for an NBA title. A little bit of ahead of schedule, I think we all realize, but basically for them, they're just trying to shore up their depth now, have extra experience for the playoffs, maybe get a vet in. The problem for them is that they don't have really any significant assets to trade. The two guys that come to mind are Danny Green and Evil Danny Green. Dylan Brooks. Dylan Brooks is on an expiring deal. Danny Green, of course, is also on an expiring deal. Danny Green, I think, will probably be moved. Brian Windhorst literally said that to his face. Dylan Brooks, I think will be interesting because we've seen how valuable Dylan Brooks is to the Memphis Grizzlies as a defender primarily and just like an emotional leader for them. However, it's also you're kind of getting the Dylan Brooks experience of similar to a guy like Marcus Smart, where you love him sometimes and you really want to like punch him at other times, right? If he's on your team, because sometimes he just makes boneheaded plays.
I mean, he just got ejected in the game, like just before we even had to record, he got ejected out of the game he was playing. So
another problem with Dylan Brooks is that, similar to a lot of other guys, he's never met a shot that he doesn't like, and that can cause some issues, especially when you have a guy like Desmond Bane who's taking less shots than him, right? So and Jaren Jackson as well. So there's some value with Dylan Brooks, a lot of value that he brings to Memphis Grizzlies. But if you can get a guy who can fit the same mold without the issues that Dylan Brooks causes, I think that's where they try to get a guy like OG Anunoby, right? Which he's been mentioned in the rumors for.
Plus, the cost of what Dylan Brooks would command on his next deal would also play a factor. Because remember, you're paying Jaren Jackson. John Morant's extension kicks in next year as well. You're going to be paying some guys. Oh, and Brandon Clark's extension also kicks in as well. So the Memphis Grizzlies are going to have some financial, things that they got to work out. So how much would Dylan Brooks want on a potential deal? I don't know. I think he would command at least 18, 19 million. I think that's pretty reasonable.
They also have a couple of like wing players who are all kind of in the same sort of realm, like Zaire Williams, Brandon Clark, etc. So they're kind of all in the same spot. So I think the Memphis Grizzlies, as I said, getting another wing player who's a little bit more established, getting another defender in. Dylan Brooks is basically their only defender on the wings, and that we saw caused an issue in the playoffs last season. Also, Steven Adams, I think, is a potential issue. He didn't even play in the playoffs last season, so if Memphis wants to get another big man to try to, mitigate those Steven Adams playoffs issues, I think that can also be, a potential option for them. As I mentioned, OG Anunoby, Jay Crowder is another name that comes to mind. Nerlens Noel.
Yeah. Get Jay Crowder back to Memphis.
Yeah. Nerlens Noel just for another big man who can, defend the rim, get some rebounds. So I think Memphis, they have some problems at the trade deadline, but they are an interesting team to mention nonetheless.
You know what? I would love to see Steven Adams from Toronto, just for the vibes. I just think he's the nicest guy in the league, man, and I think he would love it up Toronto. Imagine this guy shows up in shorts in the winter.
I wouldn't be surprised.
This is the type of guy who'd do it, man. The shorts and
he would do it.
Absolutely. So yeah, Memphis Grizzlies definitely are going to be fairly aggressive on this deadline. Speaking of another team that, to be honest with you, a lot of people aren't even talking about them anymore, and I think because a lot of people are just tired of talking about them. But the LA Clippers are potentially going to be buyers at the deadline. They have quietly got the 4th seed in the Western Conference right now. They still have Paul George. They still have Kawhi Leonard. The roster is probably the best it's been with those two guys as at the helm. Ty Lue has been doing a pretty good job at coaching them up. And I think the only real missing piece for this Clipper team is that third star, that third guy to just take the pressure off George and Kawhi, so that way they can just go for it and make that deep run that they've been trying to do since getting these two guys
especially
together.
When you look at the injuries that Kawhi Leonard and Paul George have, right? It's
exactly.
Constant missing time. You need that kind of guy that can bridge the gap when Kawhi and PG aren't there and kind of make sure that the role players are comfortable in their roles without or with Kawhi and PG.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the biggest thing that they're still looking for a point guard. And again, Reggie Jackson and John Wall have been doing decent enough jobs where the Clippers haven't completely tanked, but they need a better guy involved, a better floor general, a guy who's a lot more experienced, especially going on deep playoff runs, can hit the big shots. And obviously, the Clippers, they do have some contracts that they could flip for a potential big star. I mean, they have the Robert Covington contract. They have Norman Powell's contract, Luke Kennard, Reggie Jackson. These are all like 1 to 2 year deals with roughly anywhere between 9 to maybe $15 million a season. So definitely movable contracts that they can pair together, to get some stars. But the problem is the Clippers have absolutely 0 draft picks in over the next couple of years because they all belong to Sam Presti, scouting his 12-year-olds. But they could package some of these guys up. Another route that I think the Clippers could go is they could acquire some more depth, particularly they need another big. Ivica Zubac is probably their only playable big man that they have in their roster. I think getting another guy in there that they could potentially use as a backup wouldn't hurt their deep playoff run and reasonably affordable to get. And in terms of potential trade partners, I think the Miami Heat going after a guy like Kyle Lowry has been in the rumors. They are interested in him. I mean, Kawhi is interested in reunion with Kyle Lowry, but also Steve Ballmer just can't get an original idea for it to save his life. But Steve Ballmer and Lawrence Frank. Because
Los Angeles Raptors.
Pretty much, man. They're just trying to recreate us right now. But yeah, they're definitely interested in Kyle Lowry. They could even contact the Toronto Raptors about Fred VanVleet. Now, Fred VanVleet would actually be really good for them, I think. Also, reuniting him and Norman Powell would also be pretty cool. But again, that could potentially be a type of player that they would like to go after. Maybe contacting the San Antonio Spurs and getting a feel on Jakob Poeltl, being that backup big that they can get behind Ivica Zubac. And even maybe reaching out to a place like Houston, getting another shooter in Eric Gordon because Luke Kennard is just he ain't it. Like let's just put it.
I mean, he can shoot, but it's just like the other stuff is just it's not there. Right?
He ain't it. Like I'm sorry, get a guy, a bona fide shooter, a playoff shooter in Eric Gordon, who has gone on deep player rounds. He's an experienced vet. He knows what to do. I think he'd be a great fit with the LA Clippers. But again, the Clippers, they're in a good spot. They could make a move. Like, keep an eye on the Clippers. They could make a low key move that we all wouldn't see coming. That just could vault them back into the championship picture.
Yeah, for sure. The Los Angeles Clippers, I think they're gonna be. I mean, they came into the season with expectations to win a championship. I think they've kind of gone under the radar.
I mean, they've been coming into every season to win a championship.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, man, the Clippers I think could pull off, like you said, a low-key move. That'll definitely help them out. The final team we're going to be talking about from a seller perspective is the New Orleans. From a buyer perspective is the New Orleans Pelicans. Now, for the New Orleans Pelicans, we know who their top guys are. They're currently not up there in the standings, but we know that's due to injuries. I think when Zion Williamson, Brandon Ingram just came back, so I think when Zion comes back, I think you'll see New Orleans vault back up in the standings.
The West is also just insane. Where I think from 9 to 4, they're separated by a couple of games or something like that.
I think from to 13 or something.
It's something insane.
Like the Lakers, I think are 13th right now. They're only a few games back. They were a few games back of the 4th seed.
Yeah, it's insanely close in the Western Conference right now.
Yeah, so for them, I think they're just similar to other contending teams, trying to shore up their depth. I think them in particular are interesting because they ideally should probably try to get a starting point guard next to CJ McCollum. Now, CJ McCollum, I think, would be a pretty good starting point guard, which they kind of have been running him as since he's got there. But I think you just also want the insurance of another guy who can handle the ball, get CJ McCollum some easier shots, and, Jose Alvarado and stuff. They're all great players, but you kind of want that starting guy, right?
My guy, Jose Alvarado.
They also need some three-point shooting. They've been a bad three-point shooting team. Now, that's kind of what happens when you have Zion Williamson as your power forward, a guy who doesn't really shoot any threes.
And JV in the middle.
Exactly, JV in the middle. Brandon Ingram doesn't really shoot many threes. CJ McCollum was pretty bad from three to... He started to recover it, but again, they haven't been a good three-point shooting team, so ideally, that's one weakness that you really want to shore up going into the playoffs. And then finally, also, you want some depth due to Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson's injury concerns, as has been the case for the last couple of years. Now, for the New Orleans Pelicans, they don't have some really great immediately movable pieces. They have Devontae Graham, Jackson Hayes' expiring contract. But I think for them, the real prize is the Lakers pick. I think
Picks.
a lot. Yeah,
they got 2.
I think a lot of teams would like those picks. But besides that, they also have some guys who, contract-wise, are definitely movable. A little bit more harder to move than, let's say, a Jackson Hayes or Devontae Graham. But guys like you're mentioning Dyson Daniels,
Dyson Daniels, you have Trey Murphy.
Trey Murphy, that's what I was forgetting.
I mean, even Herb Jones, they could potentially, if the right name comes out, they might even be willing to part with Herb Jones.
Najee Marshall at the end of the bench. So they do have some interesting players that they could part with. Some trade targets. OG Anunoby, obviously we've mentioned him already. Kelly Olynyk, a guy who can stretch the floor from the big man position. John Collins, another guy who can score inside, outside. And then Bojan Bogdanovic, we also mentioned him with a couple of other teams as well. So the main focus, I think, for New Orleans, getting some shooting to surround their stars, getting some extra depth, especially in playoff situations where JV has to come out of the game and you need some sort of rim protection because Zion Williamson's not going to do that.
Yeah, I think New Orleans is in that really middle tier phase where they could, by getting the right pieces, it could help them vault them into a deeper run. But they're really just trying to establish themselves, really trying to get guys that fit their core and kind of push their ceiling as high as they possibly can. They're already doing better than a lot of us expected them to be at this stage. Now it's just about for David Griffin, how do you build on top of that? And since you have some of those great assets like the Lakers picks and a couple of these young guys that some teams are interested in, there might be something there. And I do want to throw in one honorable mention seller team that I just thought of would be the Phoenix Suns. Obviously, the Suns haven't really had the best year. Chris Paul is clearly showing signs of aging and being being that type of guy, being an older guy at this stage of his career. Devin Booker's obviously hurt right now, and they have guys names up in the air, obviously DeAndre Ayton. Does he want to be there? Do they want to keep him? That seriously wasn't a great signing. I don't know why they ended up signing him to the deal. It just still baffles my mind.
I think they were just trying to get that championship, but it clearly hasn't worked out.
Yeah, so they might be in the mix with some of these guys. Obviously, they are interested in OG Anunoby. They were interested also in Fred VanVleet from the Raptors as well. And they've been kind of poking around here and there to maybe see what they could get for DeAndre Ayton as well. So keep an eye on the Phoenix Suns as well as a low-key buyer, because again, they're not that far out of it either. Devin Booker comes back, you get the right piece in. The Suns could be right back into the mix as well because they still have a pretty good roster, all things considered. But yeah, those were some of the buyers and sellers heading into this trade deadline. Obviously, there were some teams that we didn't really talk about, and there's going to be other players, other names that we didn't even bring up that might even be moved. So definitely stay tuned for the NBA trade deadline. Probably, I'm hoping it's going to be pretty eventful. I think it's going to be a pretty fun show for if you're a fan of the NBA, of course. But let us know what you guys think. Agree or disagree. Who do you think is most likely to be moved at the deadline? Bringing us finally into the up and under segment for this week. Pretty short one. Not really much going on, of course, because we're in the middle of the season until right before the trade deadline. But first and foremost, are you up or under on the All-Star reserves being announced? Now, the last time we recorded our episode, we did give you guys our All-Star predictions, and the starters were announced last week. And last week. And we were pretty spot on with the starters. I think we just maybe missed on maybe one of them. But the reserves have also been announced tonight. So are you up or under on the reserves?
I'm under on it, for sure. For people who don't know yet, the Western Conference reserves Paul George, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jaren Jackson Jr., Damian Lillard, Lauri Markkanen, John Morant, and Domantas Sabonis. The Eastern Conference was Bam Adebayo, Jaylen Brown, DeMar DeRozan, Joel Embiid, Tyrese Haliburton, Jrue Holiday, and Julius Randle. So in terms of am I up or under on it, I'm definitely under because Pascal Siakam did not make it. Now, granted, I could see this coming based on how the last few weeks have gone for Pascal Siakam especially, and also combined with the fact that Toronto has not been good, to say the least.
But Shai Gilgeous-Alexander made it, and his team is just as bad, if not worse, than the Raptors. Now, I get it. Shai's been putting up great numbers, but I think what you're talking about, Pascal, and also other snubs too. Like I think Jalen Brunson was a snub as well. I think he definitely deserved it over some of these guys that made it. Like I don't think a guy like you can't put in a guy like DeMar DeRozan and then not put in a guy like Pascal Siakam. In my opinion.
I think that's where the issue lies. A lot of people are mad about James Harden as well.
That one I'm kind of okay with. Like James Harden and Trae Young are the guys that like even us we were just like we don't think there's a spot for them just because they're guards and there's just a lot of guards in the Eastern Conference. But in terms of the forward spots, like Bam Adebayo only recently started to turn his game around, and the fact that you didn't even include Jimmy Butler, arguably Miami's best player, most impactful player, to me is a little bit baffling to say the least.
Also, Jaren Jackson Jr. making
that one was a surprise.
That was a real surprise. I mean, I'm happy for him obviously, but I think a guy like Devin Booker, not including him, despite I know he's missed a ton of games, but bro, the games he has been there, like we've seen Phoenix without Devin Booker and with Devin Booker, it's a huge difference, right?
Yeah, like I think there were just way too many snubs for in a way. Like even as someone like I would even say like Jrue Holiday was another one that I'm like it was a puzzling one. I'm like why?
I mean, I get
over
it.
A guy like Jalen Brunson. I
get Jrue Holiday making it, but again, it's about. I think that's just what the new NBA is, though, right? Like we talked about parity in the beginning of the episode, and I mean, this is what's gonna happen. Unfortunately, it sucks it happened to our guy, but like I said, I kind of could see this coming, and I think that's just it is what it is. There's a lot of great talent in the NBA, and I think it's a good problem to have for the NBA.
It's
sure.
Okay. Pascal needs the rest, anyways. Like let's be honest with you.
Side note, I think Raptors fans, Pascal Siakam probably won't be happy, but I think Raptors fans would be happy that I don't think he's gonna be getting that Supermax.
Oh so, yeah, man, that's pretty good for us, man.
Yeah, that's. I don't think that's happening.
To be fair, I don't think we were gonna offer him the Supermax anyways.
Well, it would have been an interesting decision nonetheless, but I don't think it's happening at this point, anyways.
Yep.
Next up, are you up or under on all the refereeing issues we know, most notably with the Lakers game last week versus Boston? LeBron literally got hacked on the arm, and again, that was I think 4 Lakers games in the span of like 2-3 weeks where they basically got fouled on the final plays, nothing called. But not just the Lakers. I think this season we've seen a real issue with the refs. I know we've been saying that over the past like 5 years, but I think this season has really, really been up there in terms of refereeing issues. I mean, so are you up or under on all these refereeing issues?
Dude, I'm under, man. Like, I'm sorry, man. Like, as an official, it's your job to call the game as it is and to make the right call. Like, your decisions need to be impartial. Your decisions need to be the right call. Like, you shouldn't be, and I get it, you're human, you make mistakes, but you shouldn't miss the blatant stuff. Like, LeBron getting hacked on the arm to decide a game. Like, that's deciding a game right there. You don't give him that call. And then the funniest part to me was Patrick Beverley bringing up a camera to show the ref that he missed a call, and then he gets teed up because the ref didn't like being told that he's wrong. And then the ref's admitting after the game that, oh, yeah, we missed that one. But it's like, well, I'm sorry. Like, why did you hand out technical fouls like it was nothing? Because what? You were told that you did your job wrong?
I think in regards to technical fouls, even a guy like Jason Tatum, I think it's been too technical so far this season where he's literally just dribbled the ball on the floor and they're like, technical foul. And he's like, wait, what?
Like, I don't understand some of these officiating decisions, and I think a lot of them just has to come down to the fact that this is a new crop of refs that I'm noticing.
But again, we've been seeing that for like 5 years at this point, right?
Something's got to change. Like, I'm sorry, man. There's got to be a line. You have replay reviews, you have challenges, and yet you're still getting calls wrong, blatant calls wrong. That us at home sitting and watching with my televisions can see that's a foul. Like,
again, I think a lot of it has to do with the NBA trying to maintain their business brand image. But the problem I think that the NBA fails to realize is that when you lean too hard to one way, it can end up backfiring, right? And I think we're seeing a little bit too much of it where it's like the consumers are not happy with the product. Why? Because the NBA leaned too hard to one way rather than kind of finding that middle ground.
Yeah, and I don't think this problem is only for the NBA. I think the
NFL
also has that issue. Worse, the NHL is even worse than the NFL somehow. Like, officiating is bad in a lot of sports, but I think the NBA is sort of been that model of, hey, we're trying to make things right, but clearly they're not doing enough to prevent issues like these from happening. But hopefully they can fix it. Now, we've been saying that every single year, but yeah, I felt for LeBron at that moment because he should have had that game.
Yeah,
absolutely. Finally, are you up or under on Miles Turner signing a 2-year, $60 million extension? Now he can renegotiate his $17 million salary of this year. Basically, the way the Miles Turner extension is gonna works is that he gets basically a free $18 million check on top of the $17 million he's earning this season, which means his remaining 2 years on the deal are going to be, I believe, $18 and $19 million respectively over the next couple of years. Which means for the Pacers, who have a ton of cap space in this year, they can just pay Miles Turner that money, and basically he's making about $2, maybe $3 million more than what he was already making this season for the next couple of years, making him a better trade chip. So you're up or under on the deal?
I'm up on it. Well, Miles Turner got his money. I think this contract will increase his trade value, to say the least.
It's tough to trade him this year, though, and I think
not this year for sure, but I think afterwards, and especially with the extra couple of years, giving a team who trades for him a little bit of security. Let's say that he won't just be like you have to renegotiate right away. So I think in that case, possibly not this year, but maybe moving forward. Again, we'll also see because the Indiana Pacers, Miles Turner has been a pretty good fit for them, incidentally, this season. So I think it works out for all parties. Miles Turner gets his money. The Pacers kind of get through the season. If you need to trade him later on, I don't think it'll be difficult to trade him later on.
No, because he's not on a huge cap hit that team they're going to be like, oh, no, not like a DeAndre Ayton type of money where it's like, no, I don't really want to take that on for 4 years. So, yeah, definitely a good piece of business between the Pacers and Miles Turner. It kind of sucks for us Raptor fans because now we just can't trade for Miles Turner this season. But, yeah, I think for the Pacers, I think it was a pretty smart move on their part. But with that concludes this week's episode. We hope you guys enjoyed it. Definitely subscribe to the show on all the various platforms. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and of course on YouTube. Definitely subscribe on all the podcasting platforms so you don't miss another great episode from us. Like I said earlier, this was our sort of a precursor to the trade deadline. We will be doing a trade deadline sort of recap episode on some of the biggest deals, some of the moves that we made, some of the winners and losers. So definitely stay tuned for that episode coming up in the near future. And of course, again, more content coming towards the playoffs. We're going to be gearing up towards our playoff previews and sort of those type of things will be happening as well. So definitely stay tuned for that in the future. Also, follow us on social media, Twitter and Instagram at UpLetterAndUnderPodcast, Facebook.com/UpAndUnderPodcast for all the latest updates whenever we post a new episode or a reaction to news as they occur. So definitely follow us there. Also, check out our website, upandunderpodcast.com. It's our central hub for the show. It's a place where we write blog posts with every single episode, so we don't have time to listen or watch the full episode. You can read about it on our website. Every episode is posted. The audio, video, and the written version are all posted all in one place for you guys. So definitely check that out if you haven't done so. And yeah, man, exciting times, man. I'm pretty hyped up for this next little stretch, and also for the All-Star break that I'm probably not going to watch. Yep. I'm still salty. Pascal Siakam absolutely should have been an All-Star, but you know what? Hey, he can make All-NBA.
You know what? I'll watch the draft. That'll be interesting.
Oh, yeah. You know what? The draft is actually going to be interesting because,
hey, takes us back to school.
For the first time, it's going to be, they're going to be live on All-Star Day, and Giannis and LeBron, the two captains, are just going to pick their guys on the spot. That's going to be interesting.
People are going to be salty.
They're
going to be mad.
Absolutely. And we get to see the drama live. So, we get the Harden situation, but live.
Exactly.
Oof, that's going to be good TV. TNT was smart on that one. But stay tuned for that. Yeah, man. Trade deadline's coming up soon. All-Star break as well. A lot of exciting things happening in the NBA. But with that concludes this week's episode. We'll see you guys on the next one. Take it easy.
Easy.